Hi guys, Drew here. Today I want to talk a little bit about divination. I'm going to talk about several different forms. I want to give a brief and incomplete history, talk about the basics, and give you a little bit of my own firsthand experiences when applicable. Of course, it's up to each of us to decide whether we believe in divination or not. I'm not here to convince anyone. I have tried many different forms of divination, but I have not been really drawn to most of them. And I would say that's probably true for most people. For me personally, I am really drawn to cards. I can use several oracle decks. I've even made some of my own decks. But with tarot, for me, that's not the case. I began working with tarot when I was probably 23 years old. And I did not come to my deck until over a decade later. I tried many decks. I've owned many decks. As I've said before, I worked in a metaphysical shop, so I used so many decks. It's not even funny. My reason for sharing this is if you are drawn to a particular form of divination, but for some reason it's just not clicking properly, I would say to just stick with it. Don't force it. Pick it up when you feel drawn to, and just don't give up on it. Point being, if you feel drawn to divination, experiment. Try all different things, see what you're drawn to, and if it doesn't click right away, don't give up. Because sometimes, particularly with divination, it takes quite a while. Okay, so I'm starting with dowsing rods. This form of divination may have originated in Germany in the 15th century. And it was originally used to discover metals. Of course, it came to be used to discover water in the ground at some point. Dowsing rods were declared satanic in 1662. Surprise, surprise. A form of divination being declared satanic. Who knew? Different people use dowsing rods for different methods. For instance, if you were going to use a defined water, you would hold the rods steady in your hands at a 45-degree angle and walk around until the rods cross. If you wanted to use the rods to find a particular object, you would focus on the object, set your intention, and then follow where the rods pointed. In my experience with working with dowsing rods, it might be best if you were going to do this method to use one rod at a time, because sometimes they point in opposite directions. The same method can be used to determine the energy of a space, if that makes sense. It would make sense if you worked with the tool. Like you build a rapport with the tool the way you would any other. You can also use divining rods for simple divination, yes/no answers type of deal. You know, you decide if you want the rods to cross, that means no, and the rods to go open, that means yes, what have you. I've tried several things with the divining rods, but I personally like to read energy with them. We would, for instance, have someone stand and then hold the divining rods toward them and walk toward them. And as soon as the divining rods either crossed or went out, we realized we were coming into their energy field. That's my favorite way to use them. I don't use them often, honestly. Next, Kaori shells. A friend of mine gave me Kaori shells as a gift, and I honestly have not gotten I'm not drawn to it. I think it's cool. I enjoy having them, but it's not really my thing. This form of divination, I believe it's pronounced Obi divination, is from ancient West African culture and religion. It's a simple form of divination. You get yes/no answers. I think it can be a little bit more complex, kind of like runes, if you interpret how they land in the clusterings and things like that. Kaori shell divination is often practiced in Santeria. The most basic form would be you'd have 4 shells. The tops are cut off and open, and the bottoms, of course, are kind of pursed looking. The querent asks a question, or you ask a question, what have you, and you toss the shells. And depending on how they land, you receive your answer. For instance, if they were all face up with the mouth, the part that had been cut off, up, that is yes, absolutely. If they were all down with the purse side up, then it's no, absolutely not. And then any varying degree in between. That is my very limited understanding of the Kaori shells. Pendulums. All right, I'm going to read this from the paper, the exact definition. A body suspended from a fixed support so that it swings freely back and forth under the influence of gravity. That is the definition of pendulum. A pendulum can be made of anything. My very first pendulum, I was a teenager. We were living in Japan, and I took a 50 yen coin, which if you've seen them, they have a hole in the middle, and I ran a dog chain through it, and that was my very first pendulum, and it worked beautifully. I still have it somewhere. This tool was also used originally to find gold, gems, any sort of material that had a value in the world. And the thing I think is super fascinating about pendulums is that doctors used to use them. They would hold them over the patient and locate illness or infection with them. They can be used to find lost objects or to discover unconscious feelings and emotions. And of course, they can be used for simple divination, yes or no answers. There are theories, of course, with dowsing rods as well as pendulums, that it's really your subconscious just moving the pendulum or the dowsing rods. I don't think that that negates it, even if it's true. I believe in the higher self. I believe in our higher guidance. And sometimes that guidance can come through our subconscious more easily than it can our consciousness. I'm not going to argue whether or not it is just our subconscious moving these tools, because to me it doesn't matter. So if you've never used a pendulum, what we always said in the store that I worked in was you pick a pendulum you're drawn to, and you pick the pendulum up and you hold it over your hand and you say, "Show me yes," and you see what happens. For some people it spins in a circle like clockwise, and then for others it swings back and forth one way. And then for some people, certain pendulums won't work. It just doesn't connect for whatever reason. So I would suggest trying more than one pendulum. But I think it's important to build a rapport with the pendulum and to let the pendulum tell you what's yes and what's no so that it's easier to work with. All right, let's talk about scrying. This is one of the oldest forms of divination. There's evidence that people were scrying in China in 3000 BCE. The term scrying comes from the word descry, which is to make out dimly or reveal. Of course, there are many famous scryers, not the least of which would be Nostradamus. Nostradamus preferred to use either a bowl of ink or an obsidian mirror. There's Joseph Smith, who was a Mormon prophet, and he was said to use a seer stone to contact angels. And my personal favorites, John Dee and Edward Kelly, and they used black obsidian crystals. Scrying can be used to divine past, present, and future. It can be used to find lost objects, locate people. It can be used to contact spirit guides and the deceased. It's also been used to retrieve information from the Akashic record, as well as access the astral plane. There are so many methods of scrying: liquid scrying, crystal scrying, smoke scrying, mirror scrying, even cloud scrying. So the method is essentially you focus on your chosen scrying item and you allow your eyes to relax, your third eye kicks in, and you receive information as the result of a trance-like state that you enter. I enjoy scrying. I've done it many times in many different forms. I love to do it in fire. I've done it in candle flame and glasses of wine. My scrying obsidian ball here. Just many, many things. And honestly, I rarely see anything when I scry. I typically hear things. Whenever you use any form of divination, keep in mind that it's not necessarily going to come to you or work for you the way it does for the majority of people or for your friends or what have you. Be open-minded and allow yourself to experience whatever it is that happens. Runes. Runes were originally credited to the goddess, and women were the custodians of rune magic originally. Thus, eventually, they became associated with witchcraft. It's referred to as casting the runes when you do a reading with the runes. And they come in a set of 24, one of which is blank. A lot of people like to have a special cloth that they cast on, but not everybody. You focus on your question, or the querent focuses on the question, and you cast, you toss the runes out. There are different methods for reading and for how many runes you taught, whatever, like layouts with the tarot. There are different ways to cast and do a reading with runes. So your interpretation of what happens is going to depend on what method you're using to cast, as well as the positioning, the runes in relation to each other, in relation to if they're closer to the outer edge of the reading or the inner edge. There are many factors that will determine the interpretation of the runes. And if the runes land off the surface, you cast them on, off the cloth, what have you, some people interpret that to mean that that rune is of particular importance, and other people interpret that to mean that that rune is of no importance at all. It's, again, you building a rapport with the runes and deciding your own method of reading. While I've tried working with runes, it's just never clicked. It's not something that I'm really into. I do rune magic. I use runes in spellcraft and what have you, but I just don't work with them as a divining tool. Lastly, my favorite, tarot. Tarot was originally invented to be not only a game to be played, but a divining tool, a tool for meditation, and a tool that could assist in spiritual enlightenment. The minor arcana represents the 4 elements of nature. So the theory is that if you mix the major and minor arcanas together, they will mingle together in a way that represents reality and possibly foreshadows future events. In medieval Europe, there were several attempts to make the tarot orthodox in the church because of its popularity. And one example of that is they decided they would try to relate the major arcana to the Passion of Christ. Of course, this didn't work out, so that was abandoned. Tarot has a strong connection and association with goddess. With tarot, there are several layouts you can use, and of course, each card has a meaning. Not only does each card have a meaning, but each position that you lay the card in has a meaning, and the card's meanings affect one another depending on their proximity. And just like with runes, if a card is dropped during a reading, there are readers who will put special emphasis on that card, and there are other readers who will disregard it altogether. Again, it's a personal choice. I love tarot. And as I said in the beginning, it took me over a decade to find my deck. For me, it's not as much about what the card means. And it was hard for me to work with traditional decks because I was too stuck in what the cards meant. For me, when I read with my deck, it's about the symbolism of the card. It doesn't matter what the card actually means. The symbolism speaks to me. The cards put me in a bit of a trance. Looking at them, I sort of zone out and my guidance comes to me. My intuition and my guidance read the symbols of the cards. And most of the time, the cards mean one thing in one reading and something else in another reading when I read them, because a different part of the symbolism pops out at me for that person. I connect energetically. There's a whole process that I go through, but I don't use the tarot the way a lot of people do. I'm not a traditionalist at all. It basically is a tool that opens me up to my intuition and my higher guidance. So having said that, even working with the tools, you need to find your own way. I've given you, the basics of several different divination tools and how they're traditionally used. That doesn't mean that you have to use them that way. It's just a baseline for you to start at. Make it your own and follow wherever it leads you. I hope you got something out of that. I really hope that with any of my videos, you take whatever I've given and run with it and make it your own and do whatever you can with it. Because that's what this is all about. Your personal growth, my personal growth, our journeys, and making the most of them and sharing them with each other. So yeah, until next time, much love and gratitude, guys.